I am Dr. Amanda Peterson from the Department of Language, Cultures, and Literatures. I'm in the Spanish section, and I'm going to introduce the class. I'll tell you a little bit about my discipline, and then I will pass it off to Dr. Dominguez, who will introduce our speakers for today. We are so delighted to have you all here for our second summer seminar, our USD first summer seminar through the Humanities Center. This year's is The Story of Now, Why Knowledge Matters. We have an exciting lineup of professors from all sorts of different disciplines who are going to teach us about fascinating things. The reason why we started these seminars is because we wanted our first year students to really see the importance of liberal arts education. In the pandemic, what we saw was that we can't look at one issue from one discipline. If we only look at things from a medical point of view and we ignore all the social and political and international boundary and borders and all of the care, collective care that we had in the world, we would not be able to solve this problem. And we are still working on solving this problem a year later. So what we really wanted to focus on this year was how different faculty viewed knowledge and how they could use their disciplines to explain why multiple perspectives and multiple disciplines help us to understand the world. So we're super excited for the 20 faculty that will be lecturing this next 5 weeks. And my discipline is a lot about literature and cultural studies. So we're really interested in my discipline about the signs and symbols of the world and how we can read both culture and literature and film, well, all three, through signs and symbols and the importance of language. So I'm going to be really interested listening to all of my colleagues, and I hope you guys are too. I'm going to pass you off to Dr. Dominguez now.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dominguez. I teach in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and my specialty is American politics. And one of the reasons that I was interested in this theme for our class this summer is because knowledge and civic knowledge are important to active participation in democratic citizenship. And I think, the conversations that people are having about the role of government in telling people, in informing people about vaccines and whether we should take them, and, our ability to collectively decide on truths like there is a virus and vaccines are good and the election was won by President Biden. These are, being a citizen in a democracy requires that we all have an ability to tell fact from fiction and truth from mistruth and information from knowledge. And so, developing those civic skills and that ability to critically analyze information is just essential to lifelong learning and to democratic citizenship. So I'm really excited to see what our faculty have to say about all of these issues this spring. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask our faculty to introduce themselves, our 4 distinguished faculty who are speaking with us today. And so we'll start with Dr. Laura Getz from the Department of Psychological Sciences.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Getz. I am a cognitive psychologist, and I study language and music perception. And in general, psychologists seek to understand human behavior at many different levels of analysis, the whole way down to individual neurons in the brain up to complex interactions between groups of people and the environment. And we do so using an empirical approach, designing experiments either in the lab or out in the field to manipulate different variables and see how they affect our behavior. And as a cognitive psychologist, I am especially interested in the scientific study of knowledge, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute.
Myself, I am Dr. Arietta Davies. I'm in the Department of Biology, and I am a disease ecologist. So I study how infectious diseases spread in populations, whether those populations are humans or plants or even insects. And I also teach our biostatistics class. So I'm really interested in the good and bad ways that people use graphs and other data visualizations to inform or mislead the public. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today and looking at some strategies that you can use to sort of fact check some of the claims that you see on the internet.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Moran. I'm in the Department of Communication Studies, and communication as an academic discipline is pretty interdisciplinary. So we study the way in which we think about the world, frankly. And what that means is that we know that the words that we use matter and how we talk to each other matters. And so we study these interactions, and related to kind of information and knowledge is how does language shape how we think about pretty much anything. So in this context, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about the vaccines, what are the words that we are using to describe these actions? So that's one thing that we study. I specifically am in a subcategory that's called media studies. So I look at the way in which the mass media, and then now more commonly social media, frame and present information to the public, and then how that interactions between audiences and the media kind of shape their identity, shape how they think about the world, and shape how they think about themselves and others. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
Hi, I'm Dr. Babka. I am in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at USD. I'm thrilled that you're all here today on a summer day, a beautiful day. So congratulations to all of you for showing up. Yay! I study the relationship between religion and art. I'm also interested in the relationship between art, religion, and technology. And so I'll be teaching a class this year on AI and film and religion. And so we will be talking about truth and perception and what it means to try to get to something real.
With that, I'm just going to let Dr. Getz get started.
So as I mentioned, I am a cognitive psychologist, and cognitive psychologists are especially interested in the scientific study of knowledge. And this includes how we acquire knowledge, how we gather information from our senses and choose what to pay attention to at any given time, how we retain knowledge through different short-term and long-term memory systems, and then how we use this knowledge for higher level functions such as problem solving, decision-making, language, and reasoning. So these things might seem pretty objective. What you see as the color red, you assume is the same color red that I see. What I remember about class last semester is the same thing that you remember. When I speak the word beach, you hear the word beach, right? But cognitive psychology actually tells us a different story, which is that our experience is largely a construction of information coming from our senses, mixed with a variety of our prior knowledge and expectations. So we take this bottom-up sensory information driven by our senses, information coming from those different lower levels and help us to organize that information. But at the same time, we also have this top-down information that's coming from our prior knowledge and experience. And because of that, that means that things like perception and memory are actually not as objective as we might think they are. And so what I would like to do is go through several examples with you about how this top-down information can influence your perception, your cognition, and your memory. And I want you to actively participate in some of these demonstrations. So get the chat up and be ready to reply in the chat to some of these demonstrations that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to start with knowledge acquisition. So this is, again, information coming from our five senses and interpreted by your brain as our experience of perception. And so this interpretation, as I said, is not just bottom up. We're not just objectively seeing everything, but it's also driven by the context. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you an image, and I just want you to type in the chat whatever it is you think you see. There's no right or wrong answer. So what is this image? So you can see that there are some 13s and there are some Bs there, right? It could be either one of those things. And so what you would typically see is that if I give you more information, if I give you a particular context, now if I say, in this case, what is the center object, right? It would be much more likely that you're going to say that that is a B. Whereas if I gave you this context here and said, what is the center object? now it would be more likely that the same perceptual input you would see as a 13 instead of a B. Right, so again, the idea here is that we have identical perceptual input, but the surrounding context leads you to a different interpretation of that same input. And you might have seen this several times. These things have blown up on social media. For example, do you remember, what color is this dress? Right, so I don't know, go ahead and type in the chat what color you see it here again, right? And you can see that we're all looking at the same thing, but some people are saying it's blue and black, and some people are saying it's gold and white, right? So the reason that this happens is because our brain is always making assumptions about the different surfaces and what's illuminating and what's reflecting in this particular case. So what happens with this dress here is that people are making different assumptions about the light source in the image. So if in this image, you are assuming that it's natural light, daylight being more blue, what your brain is doing is filtering out the blue from that image because you're assuming it comes from the light and not from the actual image itself. So that leaves it to look more yellowish, and you'd see it as white and gold. But if you're assuming that this photo was taken inside under more artificial or yellow light as opposed to outdoor natural light, then you might be more likely to see it as blue and black, because now your brain is filtering out that yellow that's coming from the illuminant and leaving the image to look more blue. Right, so different people have different assumptions based on your prior experience, where you're likely to see dresses, for example, and that can change how you see the same image, right? We're all looking at the same thing, but different people are going to see it differently. And this doesn't just work for vision, it can work for auditory or other senses as well. So in this example, I'm going to play this video. It is going to be one word repeating over and over and over again, but I want you to watch the video and see if your perception of the word changes based on what you're seeing on the screen. Right, so what you probably heard is that when you had a different picture of a bill, for example, versus a bale versus a pail versus mayo, you could hear the same thing differently, right? Mayo and bill are not even that similar to each other, but you can trick your brain is tricked based on the visual input to hear something that's not actually there. Right, so again, this is showing based on the top-down expectations, this integration across your senses, that you're getting a different input. The same input gets you a different interpretation. And the examples so far have been relatively simple. Hearing different words or seeing the same stimulus differently, but the context and prior knowledge can also affect things such as facial recognition. And there's actually a lot of evidence that we are more able to recognize faces of people of our own race compared to people of other races. For example, in this study and many other studies, what people do is have faces. In this case, it was Caucasian American participants and African American participants looking at white and black faces. And what you can see here is that the Caucasian American participants were actually better at remembering or recognizing the white faces here in the pink bar. But the African American participants were actually better, had a better memory for the black faces. Right, so you can think of implications of this might have for things as simple as making friends or meeting new people and trying to remember the people that you have met, or things much more complicated like eyewitness testimony and different courtroom experiences, and how that may affect things, just your memory of different people based on the race of the face. So So far, I've shown that what you see or what you hear is not just dependent on the sensory input itself, but it also depends on your individual interpretation that comes from the context and your prior knowledge and experience. So next, I want to give you a few examples of how knowledge is retained so that it's available when it's needed through memory encoding and retrieval. And prior knowledge can also be important for knowledge retention. So look at these 9 versions of the Apple logo without actually looking at a computer or anything else, and see if you can pick out which one of these is the correct logo, and type in number 1 through 9 in the chat. There's lots of varied responses here, right? Maybe 8 is the most common response. The truth is, none of these is the correct version of the logo. 8 is the closest, but the leaf faces the opposite direction in the logo, right? So what this shows is that even though this is something that you've seen many, many times in the past, you may not have actively stored it in your memory, and so you have to reconstruct what likely happened. And so all of this shows that memory is about construction. So memory is not the same thing as watching a video of a previous event. When a camera person records an event, they can play it back exactly as they happened, right? If you watch this video of this class later, you can play it back exactly as it happened, but that is not what your memory is actually like. Your memory is more like an edited video. You keep the key details about an event, but it might be changed and distorted based on your expectation, just like a news crew may edit the videos to give you the details that they think are most important or relevant to a particular event or story. So your memory is almost always a combination of the actual event plus your prior knowledge. You combine what actually happened with what you believe probably happened, and that's what actually makes up your memory. So this leads to different types of memory distortions. For example, one type of distortion is called misattribution, which is where you may remember events, details of an event incorrectly. So one example from my previous experience is I had this very vivid memory of going on the Frozen ride at Epcot in Disney World on my honeymoon, which was in 2014. But turns out that that ride did not exist in 2014, and it didn't exist till 2016. And so what actually happened was I had watched a ride through of the ride on YouTube, and then I conflated that with my memory of actually having been on the actual ride the last time I was in Disney World. So this happens all the time. You can probably think of examples where this has happened to you as well, where the details of the event are misattributed to the actual event that they happened. You may have remembered an incorrect person was there with you at a particular event, and therefore assumed that they had knowledge that they did not. Another example is about memory bias. So I want you to think about these sentences. I'm going to ask you to remember them in a second. So don't write them down. Don't take a screenshot. I'm just going to ask you about these sentences in just a minute. So the flimsy shelf weakened under the weight of the books. The absent-minded professor didn't have his car keys, and the new baby stayed awake all night. All right, so now in the chat, I'm going to ask you to fill in some of the words from these sentences. Right, so the absent-minded professor blank his car keys. Lots of people saying forgot, a few people saying lost, didn't have, misplaced, right? What about the new baby blank all night? Have cried, stayed awake, didn't sleep, right? A number of different options here. And then the last one, the flimsy shelf blank under the weight of the books. We have buckled, we have fell, we have weakened, we have collapsed. Right, so the actual words in these sentences for the first one was the absent-minded professor didn't have his car keys, right? But a lot of people might have said lost or misplaced or something like that. The new baby stayed awake all night, not cried all night. And then the last one, the flimsy shelf weakened, not collapsed under the weight of the shelf. But what happens here is if you don't remember the word, what you're likely doing is just making an inference about what would make sense in that particular case, right? So if you don't actually have the memory, you're making an inference about what would make sense to fill in that sentence, which is why the absent-minded professor lost his car keys would be something that would make sense to fill in that sentence. Right, so this again shows our memory is biased based on the inferences and our prior knowledge about what likely happened in that particular scenario. And finally, I saw someone mention in the chat Elizabeth Loftus. So yes, she is one of the most famous memory researchers, specifically looking at false memories. So in this particular example, this is a classic false memory experiment. So what happened in this particular case is people were asked to watch a film of a particular car accident. And then they were asked about the video in a different way. So people were either asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, or they were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other or contacted each other. Right, and so then we can look at how fast the people thought the car was going based on only changing that one word in this the question. And what they found was that people said if they contacted each other, how fast were they going when they contacted each other? People said about 32 miles an hour, versus how fast were they going when they smashed into each other? People said about 42 miles an hour. So this is about a 20% change in how fast the cars were going just by changing that one word in the question. Right, so this shows that how you ask the question can change someone's perception of a particular event. And then what they did is they went back and asked a week later about someone's memory for that video that they had watched. So 1 week later, they asked, do you remember seeing any broken glass in the video? Right, there was no broken glass, but we can look at what word people were given and whether that influences whether they have this false memory of seeing broken glass. And what they found was that if you had the question a week ago, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, you're about twice as likely to have this false memory that there was glass in the video as if you had the question, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Right, so again, the implication of this is it's really important how you ask questions for false memory retrieval. So you can have false memories of a particular event just by how you ask the questions about the video afterwards. So again, thinking of the implications for things like eyewitness testimony. So what all of these examples show is that memory is not a perfect reconstruction. We have this top-down context and expectations are actually shaping your memory of an event. And this is largely driven by what are called schemas, which is your representation of particular events or particular people, right? So what is likely to happen in particular social cases or about particular people or events, and that will actually shape your memory for those events or those people later. So now we've seen that our perception and our memory are not as objective as we would like to think, and they're largely shaped by context. So the last then is thinking about language use. We use knowledge to make decisions. How objective are we in actually making decisions? So in general, humans are not very statistical or calculated in the way that they go about making decisions. We're largely guided by emotion and other incidental factors. So we often use our gut feelings to decide our decision making. You would lean towards an option that's associated with positive feelings, stay away from something that gives you negative feelings. And this can also relate to forecasting your emotions for the future. So this is called affective forecasting, which is your ability to predict your own emotions in response to a particular decision. For example, in this example here, I forecast that winning the lottery will make me happy forever, right? That's why people play the lottery, because they think that they will be very happy if they win the lottery. It will change their life forever. But it turns out that we're actually pretty lousy at predicting our future affect. And winning the lottery is not actually going to permanently change or put you in a positive mood. So other incidental factors, even things like the weather, have also been shown to influence decision making. So in one particular study here, they were looking at admission officers at colleges and looking at the likelihood of admitting people who had different traits on sunny days versus cloudy days. And they found that on cloudy days, academic traits like someone's GPA were weighted more heavily on cloudy days, whereas social traits like your extracurricular activities were weighted more heavily on sunny days. And so what this shows is that depending on the weather, we think that people are being objective in their decision making, but we're not actually usually using the making optimal use of the information or having stable preferences. And all of these incidental factors and emotions can actually change our decision making. And one final concept to keep in mind about making decisions is what's called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency to be more responsive to evidence that confirms beliefs that you already have, as opposed to evidence that challenges your beliefs, right? So if something if you read a headline and it goes along with something you already believe, you're more likely to just take that at face value and not look for alternative explanations. Whereas if you read a headline that goes against with something you already believe, you're going to try and do mental gymnastics to come up with alternate reasons why that might be the case. And so this can take many forms, and my point in bringing it up is just to remind you that the decisions we think we're making objectively based on facts may still be biased based on where you get those facts and how hard you search for alternative explanations. So even our decision making is not just based on bottom-up factual inputs, but also based on our interpretations of the context, and that's largely based on our prior experiences and knowledge. So through all of these examples here, I hope I've convinced you to rethink how objective your perception and your memory and your cognition are, and realize how much expectations and prior experience and context can influence what you see and remember, and how individualized all of these things really are. And just a final note here, I wanted to put in a plug for my lab. If you find this type of work interesting, I direct the LAMP lab for language and music perception. So check out the website and send me an email if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to just briefly introduce myself again. I'm in the biology department, Dr. Arietta Fleming-Davies, and I am from San Diego originally, but I left for a long time. I left when I graduated high school and didn't come back until 2017 when I started this job at USD. I'm really excited to be back. I'm a disease ecologist, as I said, so I study how infectious diseases spread in populations. So right now, that's basically the same thing as wearing a button saying, ask me about COVID, but you're welcome to ask about COVID or about vaccination or anything related to that. I teach a disease ecology course for upper division students. And most of my work is actually now done in this insect system. So using these insects, so this is the Gulf fritillary butterfly up in the right, and then the caterpillar, and then on the right, caterpillar that has been killed by a lethal virus that causes what we call a zombie disease. So it actually changes the behavior of the insect when they get infected. So I use field experiments and a lot of math, and I'm also working with an amazing team of USD students. So this is one who got a picture to us in time of our lab in the field this summer. So they're in the lab right now without me. And so like Dr. Getz said, if disease is something you're interested in, or if biology is something you're interested in, I hope that I might see you in a future class, or even for future lab work, working on your own research projects in our course, in our department. All right, so what are we talking about today? We are talking about how do you know what to believe on the internet, right? So lots and lots of things on the internet, lots of things out there. Some of them might be helpful, some of them might have some truth. And the worst case, they could be very harmful, or in the middle, there's a bunch of things that are probably not too helpful, not too harmful. So how do you know what to believe? We're going to talk about, so I'm addressing this from my perspective, right, which is someone who works with data, works with graphs, statistics. And so we're going to work through three main points. The first is I wanted to briefly address first this idea you hear sometime that I'm not an expert, therefore I don't know what to believe. Therefore, there's no way that I can tell what's going on here. And then the bulk of my time is going to be spent on graphs and data, right? So what are the basic skills you need in order to see if you can believe what someone is telling you, right? Like a lot of times people will provide you with what they call or data or scientific facts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are trustworthy. Fortunately, you don't have to be an expert to evaluate those. You just need some basic data literacy skills. Lastly, I'm going to just really briefly touch on first-hand accounts, because this is something that I encountered, this idea of if you see a picture or video, it must be true. This is not in my area of expertise. It's just something I ran into when I was looking for some examples for this course. So I wanted to bring it up a bit. All right, so I'm not an expert. Let's talk about that first, right? So you hear this a lot in the news, particularly from politicians. Politicians are always saying this, right? So I'm not a climate scientist, therefore I cannot possibly address the evidence for global warming, for climate change. I'm not an epidemiologist, therefore I have no opinion on COVID or on public health measures to stop spread of COVID, or just the most general term, right? Like I'm not a scientist. So those things might be true, right? Most politicians are not scientists. They're not, let alone a specific type of scientist, but they're also relying on this fallacy, which is that you need a PhD in a field in order to have an informed opinion about a topic that involves science. And that's absolutely not true. You do need a little bit of background, some basic reasoning and some examples, right? You need to have seen ways that people provide truthful or less true data. But a lot of it is you just need common sense, right? You just need to take a moment to decide, I'm not just going to believe this, I'm going to stop and evaluate it. And the other side of this, right, is that just because someone is an expert also does not mean you should believe everything they say, right? So just because they have that medical degree or they have that PhD or they're, someone older who you respect, that's great. You can respect them and still not take everything they say to be the solid truth, right? You can look into it for yourself. All right. So as I said, my perspective here is a lot about data visualizations, also called graphs. One of my favorite ones is behind me on the screen here. We'll talk about this one later. But basically, a good rule of thumb is the closer you can get to the raw data, right? So the numbers that have been collected about whatever it is you're trying to evaluate, the easier it will be for you to decide, can I trust what these people are saying, right? And so I'll be using the term claims quite a bit in this lecture. So what do I mean by claims? I mean a statement, right, that someone is making that's allegedly based on some sort of scientific evidence, right? So when I say, I'm not talking about like gold rush claims, I'm talking about something that someone is telling you. How can you evaluate those? All right, so let's look at some bad graphs first, right? So first couple are going to be just on sort of arbitrarily chosen topics, and then we're going to look at quite a few from disease and specifically vaccination, because those are my areas of interest in research. All right, great. So this first one, we're going to be doing some text chat again. All right, so what's wrong with this graph? So put your answers or guesses, could just be guesses, in the text chat. Either to the whole class, the way you were doing with Dr. Getz, or if you are feeling kind of shy, you can also just send it to me as a private message directly, and then I will read out your contribution, but without sharing it. Without sharing your name, sorry. Okay, great. These are already coming in. You guys are so much faster than last year's class. I don't know if that's good or bad. It means a lot of Zoom time, but I really appreciate all your participation. Okay, all right. So fast, you are freezing my Zoom chat. So I see some things about the average. The average is off. Scaling is off. Yeah, something is going on. What is our scale? We have no scale at all, right? Where are our numbers on the Y? We have no idea. What's going on with our average? Our average is 43, and it's showing it on this vertical line that's going right above the box that says 52. So something is wrong there. What else is wrong with our average? Other thoughts on that? Yeah, no labels. We have some gaps. Why is Friday first? Oops, sorry, let's go back to this one. I have no idea. Our work week doesn't usually start on Friday. And then the average of these numbers cannot be 43, right? You don't need to do any math, arithmetic, no calculators needed. The average is always going to be a number somewhere in the middle, right? Our lowest one is 50. So lots of terrible things going on with this graph. All right, let's look at a little bit of a harder one next. Okay, so this one is disease. So I have two activities for you. So put your answers and guesses again in the text chat. What is wrong with this graph? But then also I want you to use your annotate function, please, to annotate the part of the graph that you are the most concerned about, right? So any stamp you want, I'd say use one of those little stamps, yeah, or circle it, great. All right, yeah. And then if you can, so go ahead and just mark on there what you're worried about. And then what, go ahead and annotate. Yeah, lots of circles or just use those little stamps. Yeah, great. All right, so what is going on here? You guys are such enthusiastic annotators. I love it. I love it. So first of all, we got a pie chart. We're going to talk about in a minute. Friends, do not let friends use pie charts. Dr. Getz could probably tell you more about this because it's based on human perception. Humans as a group, we are really bad at estimating how big angles are. We're much better at areas. Angles, really difficult. So first of all, we're using a pie chart, which is causing us extreme problems. And then, okay, I love the annotations. I'm going to clear them real quickly so we can focus in on this piece right here, this blue, that lots of people, okay, this is me now. Lots of people are focusing in on this slice. Why? Well, we got 18%, and then this one is 19%. That doesn't look great at all. In our text chat, we also have some people noticing that these numbers do not add up to 100% at all, right? And it turns out that what they're trying to do is this one is 18% of this 51%. So they're trying to show us that this is a subtype of this strain within this Sydney group. Other people pointed out, what are these labels even, right? So these are strains of norovirus. Norovirus is a very contagious virus. It's sometimes called the cruise ship virus, although I guess maybe COVID has taken over that title by now, but causes the stomach flu, 24-hour stomach flu, projectile vomiting, not fun. It is it's very transmissible. And so strains are just like in COVID, different genetic types, right? So as this virus evolves through the population, we get slightly different genetic strains that have different symptoms, et cetera. And so this was tracking a norovirus outbreak in Australia. And so it's not a flu, I should say that also. It's called the 24-hour stomach flu, but it's not actually a flu virus. It's a norovirus. So anyway, so the CDC, right, is not purposefully trying to be confusing here. And yet, because of the problems with their graph presentation, it's really hard for us to know what's going on. So let's just use these first two examples that we saw to summarize. Oh, wait, first, friends don't let friends use pie charts. Okay, 3 pie charts. Annotate the one with the largest amount of yellow. Just make a little stamp on the one that has the highest yellow. Yeah, really hard to tell. And yet, if we did this as a bar plot with the axis starting at 0, like we should, much easier to tell, right? The patterns being shown in these 3 graphs are actually completely different from each other. This left one, yeah, you can't annotate it on the bar plot. That's not fair. Yeah, everyone could tell on the bar plot, right? Compared to the left to the right, that one's definitely higher. And like I said, the patterns are completely different. So the ones on the left, they're all increasing, right? It's increasing from red to black. And on the one on the right, it's decreasing from red to black. But I'm going to clear your annotations again, so you can look at the pie charts again. Impossible to see that pattern that's actually really very obvious in the bar chart. So be very suspicious of all pie charts, whether they're meant in good faith or not. All right, so using those bad examples, we can summarize some sort of rules for good graphs that those of you who are going to be making graphs with your own data can follow. But you can also use these guidelines to check graphs that you see on the internet, in the news, even in scientific papers, right? So graphs that break these guidelines are more likely to be misleading, right? So we want to show the data. We don't want to be hiding the data. We want to make those patterns easy to see. Represent our magnitudes honestly, right? So that often in a bar graph means starting from 0. That means that the amount of area that's colored in should match any numbers that are labeling the graphs, which is not the case at all on that last CDC pie chart we saw. And so these are just some things to keep in mind. I'm going to move on to our vaccine examples because I'm probably running out of time. All of those good graphs rules were sort of just a way for you to practice using data visualization skills to evaluate the claims presented in graphs. There's another set, a much larger set of skills, also under this envelope or umbrella of data literacy, that are basically different logical fallacies that you'll see coming up. And I'm going to show some examples of this from people in the group that I would broadly call vaccine deniers, right? So people who are not necessarily only skeptical about vaccines, but are actively trying to spread misinformation about vaccines. And you have to be careful because a lot of this information is what comes up on the internet first when you search for something like COVID vaccine, right? Or HPV vaccine, something like this. So we're going to be looking at some examples here, right? A lot of them are doing some or more of these, one or more. So only showing part of the data, picking data that will support your claims, choosing an extreme metric to look at, such as deaths instead of infections, using absolute numbers, and equating harm from the disease to harm from the vaccine. So let's look at this first one. Sorry, before we look at the first one, I want to let you know what I want to know from you in the chat, please. So first of all, what is the specific false claim they're making? So they're all making false claims about vaccines, and they're using real data to do it. So my second question is, what's wrong with this graph? It's not the data. None of these data are made up. They're taking real numbers that were collected in a scientifically rigorous way, and they're presenting them in a way that relies on these logical fallacies to support a claim that is actually not supported by the data at all. So first one up. All right, we got this bar graph. So we've got time starting from 1912 going to 1982. And then we've got the number of deaths from measles in the US. So what is the claim? So the claim, and I'm going to give you guys a piece of information that you might not know, which is when was the measles vaccine introduced? And the measles vaccine was introduced somewhere around here, right? So remember, we are looking for a false claim about vaccines, right? So claim is that measles doesn't exist anymore. Great, that could be a great false claim. What is the black bar showing? Excellent question, right? We got blue and black bars. We don't know which is which. Actually, they mean nothing. They're just alternating. Oh no, except those ones aren't. No idea. So not following the rules of good graphs. They're not being honest here. Yeah, so their claim here, right, is that vaccines are not the cause of this decrease in deaths. Why? Because the decrease in deaths started before the vaccine was introduced, right? So that is the claim that's going on here. How do we know it's false? sorry, my computer has had a hard year of Zoom. So, all right. So lots of things are leading to this change in number of deaths from measles, right? Whoops. But our problem here is that they're not looking at the correct response variable, right? So they're looking at how the number of deaths has changed, but they're not considering measles cases. So this period of time between 1944 and 1964, the number of deaths from measles had already gone down quite a bit. Why? Because of lots of other advances in modern medicine. However, measles cases were still very high. And why is that a problem? Well, death is not the only thing to avoid, right? I mean, we don't want anyone to die from infectious disease, right? But measles also causes a lot of other effects besides death. It can cause permanent scarring, right? So like facial, it can cause sterility, right? So infertility, particularly in males, right? So you get measles as a 5-year-old, maybe you don't have any symptoms, you're fine. Then you're 30, you're trying to have children and you can't because you had measles. So just looking at death is kind of misleading. And when we look at actual cases, which is what we're trying to prevent with the measles vaccine, right? We see this huge drop in the number of cases of measles when the vaccine was first licensed and used throughout the US. And then we get these tinier little spikes later, right? And that was before the second booster shot was implemented. So it turns out that the immunity doesn't last forever for the measles vaccine, although it's very, very close when you have that second booster. And so when we started getting these little outbreaks, then we recommended that second dose as a country, and then now back pretty much to zero. So, all right, I'm gonna hurry now. I'm definitely running behind. So let's just look briefly at one more example, and then I'll skip the final one. So this one I really want to emphasize. It's a similar logical fallacy, and it also has to do with the reading that you did for today. It's the same logical fallacy that you saw in that 99.99% caffeine free. So thoughts on this one, just go ahead and put those in the chat. So the claim they're making here, right, that no one has died from measles in the last 10 years in the US, whereas they're stating that 108 people have died due to measles vaccinations. So it seems to be a very strong point, right? But something is very wrong with the way they're using these data. Even though the data are correct, right? This virus database is run by the federal government. If you've had your COVID vaccine already, you might have contributed to that. If you got the text alerts to report your symptoms, those went to that database. And it is true that in the last 10 years, well, not this year, not anymore, but 2004 to 2015, no one had died of measles in the US. Yeah, great. Keep these coming in. So hardly anyone gets measles anymore, whereas almost everyone gets the measles vaccine, right? And so by using the absolute numbers, right? So this is just by absolute numbers, I mean like the number of people. Instead of the percent, we are really misleading people. So very, very few people have been infected with measles in the last 10 years or the 10 years before this graphic. But MMR is required for attending school and recommended by pediatricians across the country. And so almost every person has had the measles vaccine. So ignoring the denominator means we should really be dividing this by the number of people in each of these groups in order to get the percent of people that are likely to have died either following measles vaccination or due to measles, right? And so you can think that 330 million people in the US about right now, right? You can think about what percent of those are children, maybe 10% have been children in the last 10 years, maybe more. So we're talking about like 60 million people. So we're dividing by 60 million people. So this number on the right is also basically zero, right? So if we think about it as a percent, we can realize that the claim that they're making is not really supported here. It gets even weaker when we think about where these data are coming from about deaths following the measles vaccines. So they are making this really common mistake of taking correlation to be causation. So this database does not actually show that the measles vaccine was the cause of death. It just shows that people who had the measles vaccine had died within that 30 or 60-day period following it. So it is a potential cause of death. Young children, right? So infants and very young children are the age at which you get this first MMR, which is unfortunately still, even today, one of the periods of higher mortality throughout our lifespan until we get back into the very beginning of life and the very end of life. And so this is actually not even showing us evidence that that these deaths were due to the measles vaccines. All right, I'm going to move along because I hear people leaving the Zoom. So, and I just wanted to say that this is exactly the same reasoning, right, as the example from your reading with the 99.99% caffeine free. All right, so I want to do one more example in our third category. So this is something that's new to me, but this idea of, can you trust firsthand accounts, right? So maybe you can't trust these graphs and statistics, but if you have a picture or a video of someone actually experiencing something, can you trust that? That seems like it would be more trustworthy. So one last annotate exercise before we leave. Which of these people is real? So please annotate, put a stamp on the photo of the person who is a real person. The other person is not real. They were generated by computer software. And we are also, I think, here demonstrating some psychological effect that people tend to go with the crowd. All right, so very, very hard to tell. This person on the left is actually the real photo and the right one is a composite. So if you want to learn more about this, you can go to the webpage with our, from our assigned reading. Because this is not my area of expertise at all, but basically it's just saying that you should be hesitant of believing these so-called first-hand accounts. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to address is actually your assignment for this week, but I could come back and do this at the end if that works for the other professors. I think let's do that. So just note that your assignment for this week, we're going to ask you to address scientific myth or misconception using these strategies. All right, so to wrap up with some key points, if you take away one thing from this lecture at all, it's that you don't need to be an expert in a specific field in order to evaluate whether you can trust a particular claim, right? You just need some basic data literacy skills and just use your own common sense, right? So you can look at the graphs, look for common problems, do the numbers on the graphs, match the size of the areas to your axes start at 0. And I always tell students in my class, you know more than you think, right? Use your common sense. Too many of us just turn off our common sense when we see numbers. Maybe it's that math anxiety response. You've been alive in the world for a long time. You know a lot about what's going on. And so, you know, if you don't believe something, then seek more information, right? Don't just decide. You can't just decide, oh, I'm not going to believe it, right? But you can say, I'm not sure about this. Let me find out more, right? Particularly context. What is the context for the numbers or statistics that people are giving you? And finally, which I think you already know as a group, right? Don't trust everything you see on the internet or even off the internet. It's always a great thing to keep questioning the things that you're learning, either in class or out of class. And if you keep doing that, then you will find your knowledge, your own knowledge expanding, right? And when I say don't trust everything you see or believe or hear, right, that also includes things that you believe personally, right? So like we just saw in Dr. Getz's talk, your own mind can also deceive you. So it's really good to fact check your own beliefs and your own sort of gut instincts as well. All right, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all your annotating and your participating. I look forward to meeting some of you at my discussion sections this week, and that's it from me.
what I'm going to talk about primarily today is a little bit about journalism, about the information that you get from different media sources. And what we can think about is from the psychological perspective is that your pre-existing schemas that Dr. Getz was describing, we bring to the news media, we bring it to our interactions with sources of information. And so that's going to shape how we interact with the things that we see. And then, you know who loves pie charts? If anybody wants to put this in the chat, journalists love pie charts. And you will see pie charts all over the media because they're a nice visual representation. But as we learned, they can be misleading. So that is definitely problematic. So let me tell you a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about today before we get into it. I titled my talk, TikTok Truth and the Law, not because I'm a big fan of TikTok. In fact, I don't really do TikTok very much or look at it. But we know that TikTok as a social media platform has become really influential and popular with not just your generation, but across the generations. And I saw a question in the chat in the last talk about whether or not misinformation or misleading information is more likely to impact people who are less familiar with social media. And it's interesting. It's true. Certainly your grandparents' generation, if they're getting information from, perhaps Facebook, if they think they're really cool, they are more likely to believe things in the kind of social media realm without having a lot of critical media literacy skills. However, even those of you who are really what we would call digital natives and participate in social media and all these different types of things, maybe you're even content creators, are still likely to be susceptible to some of the manipulative practices that the companies engage in. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Personally, I study in my kind of research agenda, I study Spanish language media and the way in which media is utilized with different immigrant groups and generational groups and identity formation. And I look at culture and all sorts of different things within the media and how they interact with families. I teach a class on children in media so that we can talk about the different stages of life developmentally. So all sorts of different things when it comes to studying how media interact with our daily lives. But what I'm going to focus on today, so we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between social media and legacy media. And the term legacy media has started to be used with the kind of the old school mass communication, broadcast journalism forms and newspapers, if you could imagine people actually touching the paper. And really kind of the differences between how people understood information from legacy media and how that's changed now on these social media platforms. One of the things that Dr. Fleming-Davies suggested is that we need to rely on our common sense a little bit in terms of, how we get information and what we kind of trust about information. And really, from a communication standpoint, our news media have been kind of the providers of what we think of as common sense, and how we interpret the world may be related to the sources from which we get that information. Now, one of the major differences, however, is when we think about traditional media formats, what the reading's called and what's become this popular phrase of legacy media, is that traditionally journalism has been seen as the fourth estate. So when I say it's the fourth estate, as Dr. Dominguez brought up in the beginning, when we think about a democratic society, we as citizens need to be informed about the world, right? We need to have political knowledge. We need to know what people believe in so that we can make decisions about who to vote for. We want to know about where people stand on political issues. We also want to know about scientific information, right? When you think about the attention to the news media when the coronavirus information was first unfolding in March 2020, I mean, we saw a huge increase in attention to news as a result because we were starved for information. So we rely on the news media to provide us with information so that we can make informed decisions. And we think about traditional media as a watchdog on both our public officials and our kind of commercial interests. So we as citizens put our trust in journalists so that we can make informed decisions in our democracy. Within that context, we expect journalists to tell us the truth. And here's where things get a little bit crazy, right? That truth shouldn't be, I don't know, interpreted, right? We expect there to be some facts, but that's not always the case, right? I mean, what is truth? I mean, that's been a really interesting question over the past, few decades, and thinking about how truth is manipulated and how facts are manipulated. So journalists themselves, when they work for a legacy media, like a big broadcast news organization, say like ABC or CNN, or they work for the New York Times, they are responsible for ensuring that they are providing evidence and factual-based information to the public. And when they don't, when they provide misinformation or things that might be misleading or not factual, then indeed they should be held accountable. So we have laws in place to ensure that when things are published or broadcast in the media, that they are indeed somehow truthful. Now, we know, if you've watched the media, that that's kind of a slippery slope of what is actually truthful. Because as someone puts in the chat, yeah, media are biased. And some media are more biased than other media because of the way in which they gather sources and the way they present material. They do this a lot so that they must, for ratings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that legacy media are held accountable to is the public interest. And what this means is if I'm a television broadcaster and I own a TV network, my broadcast station, the one that you don't have to pay for, the one that you get for free over the airways, which probably none of you in this chat actually participate in anymore, but those are licensed by the US government. So the network, NBC, doesn't pay for the right to broadcast on these public airwaves. They get special permission from the FCC to make sure that they are serving the public interest. And they have a responsibility to both tell the truth in terms of libel laws and other protections, and to provide a diversity of opinions to a mass general audience. And those really are just the big three networks: NBC, ABC, CBS, and then PBS, which is the public broadcasting service, which again, I'm guessing fewer of you are watching. And what we find over time, and this is true, research prior to the explosion of social media, is the more people participate in and pay attention to journalism that is relevant to their location, to their community, to their environment, the more likely they are to invest in their community and feel part of their community. So there's a lot of research that shows that legacy media, like your old school local media news, the more you watch that, the more you feel connected to your community and to your neighborhoods, right? So what this says is that legacy media is not divided into little different algorithms and filter bubbles. We all used to watch the same news, kind of get the same information, maybe interpreted it in different ways because of our political belief system, because of our perceptions, because of our experiences. But it was much more common for a lot of people to watch the same information than it is today. So in social media, as you all know, are much more familiar with, is that we don't know what people are watching, and we don't have a common language across social media platforms, and individual content providers are not regulated or don't necessarily have to adhere to what we might think of as the laws that regulate journalists when they're working for a legacy outlet. We also know, and if you guys have been paying attention to the news, Facebook and other like YouTube and Google are being investigated by the federal government for antitrust violations. And the FCC hasn't come to a conclusion here, but the fact that Facebook owns so many different outlets raises questions about competition. Do they have a monopoly on the industry? The other thing to note is that unlike the broadcast networks who have a relationship with the government and are licensed by the FCC and are thought of as the fourth estate and the watchdog, Facebook, YouTube, Google, these are all private corporations. And as a result, they do not have an obligation to serve the public. They have an obligation to their stakeholders. They have an obligation to their ideas of, whatever they think will be the most profitable. And what we have found over time, and again, not surprising, this isn't going to come as a shock, but social media has actually divided communities more, where legacy media tends to bring people together in terms of information sharing, even when they have different political viewpoints. And social media tend to reinforce, right, that confirmation bias that we had been talking about, where you are more likely to see things that you already believe in, and as a result, you are more likely to believe them even stronger, right? So it reinforces a perception rather than opening up different ideas. Okay. So what does this mean economically? So in a communication perspective, we kind of look at a variety of different aspects of the Communication Act. So you have the economic impacts. Why do we see the things that we do is often answered by a commercial question, has to do with economics. And then how it's interpreted tends to be on the audience side, and that has to do with our pre-existing perceptions and a variety of other contexts within that communicative act. Okay, so in our legacy media, again, thinking about this broad-based model, the way they make money is by selling the time in between the content, right? So the goal of your television channels is to get as many people as possible to watch a particular show, which means that it's not going to be, well, apart from the extreme cable networks, we're not going to talk about them because they tend to be controversial. But generally speaking, our mainstream mass market, mainstream viewers, we're trying to get as many people as possible. Currently, that means for the top rated news networks on a weeknight, you're getting between 5 and 7 million viewers. Now, going back to Dr. Fleming-Davies' point, if we know what the denominator is, there are 144 million television households in the United States. Our legacy media, they're freaking out right now because their whole economic model of making sure that tons of people were watching the television set so that they could watch the advertisements is crumbling beneath them. And so they're turning to all sorts of different ways to get viewers back. And so their model is shattering. They're trying to figure out how to create new content. And the problem with the legacy media format in terms of content creation is that they actually have to pay people to do it, right? That when you are a big network, the people that your anchors, your journalists, the people who are making your news content are professionals who are trained, who have degrees, who know information, but also require pretty high payment for them to participate in that. So social media comes in and they're like, we don't need to worry about those paid professionals. We can just get all sorts of people to make content. So the economic model of our social media is obviously subscription-based, where you sign up to be a user on a social media platform, you download the app, and they collect all of your information to sell to advertisers. And so you're giving them all sorts of information so that they can hyper market to your particular likes and dislikes. And we've all seen that happen where, you're talking to your friend and all of a sudden you get an ad on Instagram for like something random that you just mentioned that you've never seen before. So so when people worry if Google's listening to you, I can tell you that a Google professional has confirmed that indeed they are. So you have some professional content creators, and one of the readings that you guys had talked about how journalists from the legacy media are now realizing the importance of reaching out to social media platforms to get viewers into paying attention to that content. The other thing is that, that we've started seeing more and more on is not just the big influencers, but now what they're calling nano influencers, which some of you may even be a nano influencer, where this really relies on this idea that you're friends with the people on your social media, even if you don't know them in real life. And so a nano influencer is somebody who will be paid sometimes, or maybe not even paid, to promote a particular viewpoint or a particular idea. And we saw this really happen strongly in the 2020 election, where just average people, just people who were being persuaded to then spread information from different political points of view. We also know that can be maybe misinformation, because we don't necessarily know where the source of the information is actually coming from. In terms of the reach, if you look at TikTok right now, we're at 1 billion subscribers or users who have downloaded TikTok 200 million times in the US. Look back up on that PowerPoint. There's only 5 to 7 million people watching the news. So when we talk about the influence of media into our public discourse or into the news and information, it's in social media is where a lot of it's happening. Okay, so why does regulation matter? I would argue that it matters because, for me personally, when I know that there's some little, and I'm not talking about violating the First Amendment, I'm not talking about, content creation, but a little regulation can go a long way in increasing the trust of the information. So when you have somebody who is a journalist who has been trained, who perhaps is a professional that has a code of ethics that guide the output that they provide to the public, that are really interested in encouraging citizenship, that to me leads to more trust. We also have trust in what is called parasocial relationships. So those influencers that you follow, if you have a relationship with them, even if you don't know them for real, you might have people who you actually trust that you don't know. And so you will be more likely to believe them when you engage in a relationship with them. The other thing that we need to be cognizant of as we engage in social media platforms is something called filter bubbles, which maybe you have heard of that term before. But the algorithms that are being employed through the data science that's creating the content and feeding you information is feeding you information based on what you've seen before. And what that means is that you will increase that confirmation bias. You will be less likely to see information that challenges the pre-existing ideas that you might already have. And you are more likely to receive more extreme information as the algorithm progresses. And so as you begin to search for things, you will still get more and more information. And part of that has to do with all the social media platforms want you to do is pay attention to them. They're just begging for your attention, because unlike the legacy media who were selling your eyeballs to advertisers in a broad-based mass communication tactic, these guys are they're just looking for you, and it's micro advertising, and they're targeting you individually to see the things that they think that you particularly want based on the information that you've told them through your scrolling and your searching. Now, I think it's really easy for us, and I've kind of seen a little bit of this in the chat, to just say, well, everything is biased. I can't trust the news any longer. If I watch this source, it's just telling me to believe one thing. If I watch this one, it's telling me to believe something else. But I am here to tell you that there is actual information out there, and there are some sources that are better than others. And there's some media that you can trust more than others. And you need to figure out how that works into, kind of your own ability to make decisions. Because the cable networks are they can provide extreme views, but if you're watching mainstream network news, trustworthy. If you're reading mainstream journalism, I would say it's pretty trustworthy. These are the professionals who are employed to provide you with the information that is important for you to make decisions. Even on social media, there is accurate information. You just got to figure out who the source is. And so I think what you need to be able to do, and this is true from the three speakers so far, and also I think it's going to be true as we hear our fourth speaker, is that we have the ability as informed citizens to really use our education to figure out what makes sense. And if you feel like you're not seeing alternative viewpoints in your social media, seek them out. Go search for them. I see some people are recommending the documentary, The Social Dilemma. That is a scary one. And in fact, the Humanities Center, who's also putting on this class, did a whole class on it last semester as well. So I think you're going to learn more about the social dilemma in a couple of weeks too. So true, large companies do have their economic interests at heart. And that's why you need to really figure out who the sources are. That is kind of the main takeaway, is understand how to read data that you see in these news media articles, how to figure out the sources that you trust, and then also seek out multiple outlets. Look for information from a variety of sources so that you can kind of check on different things. So I will leave it at that and put the power into your hands as good digital citizens who will make informed decisions as you seek to learn more about what's happening in the world.
So I'm the last one that you have to listen to today. I hope we can go pretty fast. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of a wrap up between everything that we've heard today. I'm going to talk about truth and perception, because a lot of this might seem like something like truth isn't possible when there's so many different perceptions of reality out there. So how do we know what is true? This is a scene from my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies, The Matrix. The question drives us, says Trinity Denio. And that's something that I hope that you will all maintain, not just in college, but throughout your lives. A sense that asking questions all the time, curiosity, that's the way that we need to go. In The Matrix, the movie, the fundamental problem is the ignorance of the true nature of reality. So in the movie, The Matrix, if you haven't seen it, the idea is that the true nature of reality is something that most of us are sort of denying. And what we need to recognize in the movie is the way reality really is. Most people in the movie are living in what's called the Matrix, which is a set of illusions that are imposed by a system of bad robots. And so this is analogous to what Buddhists call samsara. Samsara is the illusory world that is not the truth of reality. And so the question I have for you is, how committed are you to the truth? How committed are you to getting beyond your perceptions or getting outside of the illusions that we sort of maintain, as Dr. Getz and Dr. Moran just said, that we sort of like our secure bubbles of illusion, that we tend to prefer those bubbles of perception to what may be true outside of those bubbles. So the question is there a world different from subjective experience or your perception? And if there is, how can we know what this is like, since we can't step outside of our experience to tell if reality matches it? And does it matter? This is the big question in a lot of the liberal arts. What matters? Does this matter, this question of what is true? Do you care about the truth? And so does it matter? Should we care whether there is a reality or a truth outside of our subjective experience or outside of our perceptions? So here's the elephant in the room. This is something that philosophers call relativism. I have my truth, you have your truth, if we each have our own perspective, and so our own truth or morality, isn't that enough? And so the idea is that here, some people have their morality, some people have their morality. The problem with this is that if we're all operating in our own moral frames as though the other people's moral frames don't matter, then we're looking at no one is going to ever act morally, and we're going to do all sorts of horrible things to each other. So relativism as a philosophical, idea doesn't really work. And so the idea here is that we have to try to get past relativism. We have to be willing to be committed to what the truth might be. So here's the parable of the blind people and the elephant. This is an ancient parable. It goes all the way back to ancient India. And basically what this parable says is that there's all these blind people that are surrounding this big elephant. One blind person says that he's next to the tusk, as you can see from this relief in Thailand. He's next to the tusk, and so the elephant is smooth and kind of cool. The one over by the tail is thinking, no, he's kind of fuzzy. The one who's clutching the leg thinks, oh, he's wrinkly and kind of big and round. And so they each have truth in their perceptions, but they don't have the big picture. They don't have the big elephant. And they don't have the problem as a whole, the problem of what is the truth of the elephant as a whole. At USD, what we call integration is how all of these different academic subjects approach one true elephant. They work together. And so there's one true elephant we're all trying to get to, whether it's the truth of vaccines or the truth of a political system or the truth of a certain scientific discovery. And we all need these academic disciplines that are giving us one piece of the elephant to work together so that we get the bigger picture. So to know the truth of the elephant, we have to be committed to finding truth beyond our individual perception. And that goes back to the matrix question. Are you committed to whatever the truth is? Truth is therefore always approached through social interaction, conversations, dialogue, argument, debate. And these things are crucial to what it means to be educated and to what it means to know which information sources to rely on. We have to talk to each other, and we have to talk to each other respectfully, and we have to engage always in dialogue. So here's René Descartes. You may know him from, in math, Cartesian coordinates. Descartes said that if you are willing to be a real seeker, someone who's committed to the truth, it's necessary that at least once in your life you doubt as far as possible all things. So what he was trying to get to actually in philosophy was certainty. He thought that certainty was possible. It really isn't, but he thought doubt would be the way to get there. He caused a sea change in our understanding of truth in terms of Western thought. So the distinction that he sort of clarified between subjective truth and objective truth. So subjective pertains to perception. Objective truth is what exists apart from your perception on its own. And Descartes created that sort of way of distinguishing those things. Descartes thought that objective reality is what's mathematically measurable. And so he was sort of ushering in more of the scientific revolution. He said that science is the way that we see what is measurable in terms of objective reality. But what is perceived with the senses, as Dr. Getz pointed out earlier, is subjective and not reliable as reality. Descartes got this from Plato. Plato got this from Socrates. So Socrates was the great philosopher in ancient Greece who said that you should know yourself. You should know what you believe in. You should know what you hold dear, what beliefs you hold dear. and that you should also engage with another divine soul. Within you is divine reason. Through dialectic and encounter, we encounter someone who also has a way into divine truth. And so we all have ways into this. This is something called hermeneutics, the science of interpretation. Hermeneutics comes from the Greek god Hermes. Hermes, as you can see here, has little wings on his ankles because he is the messenger god. He is the god who basically brings all of the messages and ideas from one person to the next on Mount Olympus. And so hermeneutics is the science of how we get the message out of data, out of literature. We can interpret literature in different ways. We can interpret an artwork in different ways. We interpret an event in different ways. And so the science of interpretation understands that there are all these different ways to acquire truth. And so we are all operating in these different interpretive frameworks. So this is what we call frames of reference in philosophy and religious studies. Frames of reference are simply our perceptions create a context, like Dr. Getz talked about. We all have contexts from which we operate. And so this helps us get beyond just one part of an elephant when we realize that our perceptions, while true for us, are limited in the truth that we can ultimately acquire. So we also have to recognize that even as much as we all have individual contexts and ways of acquiring knowledge, there are also academic disciplines that have different contexts and different forms of knowledge getting. Right? So there are scientific frames of reference, there are religious frames of reference, there are cultural frames of reference, all ways of interpreting the world. The problem is sometimes we don't understand that, as Dr. Moran just said, there are also inappropriate frames of reference. For example, an inappropriate frame of reference would be to rely on just one source of information, as though just one news channel can give me my information, or just one way of thinking. Like some people are biblical literalists. They think that every word in the Bible is literally true, and they think that's the only way to think about God. And those are inappropriate frames of reference because they further limit our ability to get to knowledge or get to truth. So there are scientific truths and religious truths. Scientific frames of reference use things, as we saw from Dr. Fleming's presentation, different graphs, measurement, data collection, experiments, verification to arrive at scientific truths. And these scientific truths can be trusted when scientists do their best to check up on each other and make sure that they are all sort of in keeping with the way things should go in a scientific frame. There are obviously going to be some scientists that won't be as trustworthy. And that's something that we have to sort of remember, that in every frame of reference, there might be some inappropriate ways that people are perceiving things. But scientific frames of reference tend toward facts, tend towards finding what is provable from a factual sort of standpoint. Facts tend to be binary. They tend to be either this or that. And that's why people tend to mix up facts and truth. Facts and truth are different though. For example, I am married to a man and I've been married to him for a very long time. I think I know him pretty well. I can prove to you that I am legally married. I have my legal marriage license. It's all, acquired from a reputable source, the government. And so I can prove I am legally married. If I were to get divorced, I would need that marriage license. Those are all facts, but there is no way to prove to you or to me or to anybody that my husband loves me. or that he's faithful, all things that make a marriage good. Those are the truths of marriage. How faithful is he? How faithful am I? How good is the marriage is a matter of sort of subjectivity and belief and perception. And that's where we get kind of mixed up. We get sort of, because I can't prove that my husband loves me. He could be doing a very good imitation of someone who loves me. He could be doing something that is really underhanded and criminal, and I don't know about it, maybe because I'm in denial. So proving things scientifically is going to be different than proving things from a religious frame of reference. Religious frames of reference tend to be inspired by the interest to find or make meaning or find purpose, and don't rely on factual truth necessarily. There are some facts that maybe we can rely on in terms of religious studies. We can rely on historical facts. We can rely on scientific facts in religion. But in terms of proving something, like the question of God's existence, we can't do. No one can prove God exists. No one can prove God does not exist. So that question doesn't really work from the standpoint of how religious frames of reference operate. So that's why sometimes scientists sort of throw out the question of God because it's not provable. Well, it's not provable that my husband loves me either. It's not even provable that I love him. I could be doing, again, a very good imitation of loving him. He could be doing a very good imitation of loving me. And those things aren't necessarily fact. And so when we're looking at the question of God, it's just not subject to factual, provable truth. The frame of reference is flexible. It's less binary. As we're seeing now with gender studies, gender is also not something subject to fact. It is not a fact that something is masculine or feminine. Masculinity, femininity, and all the different ways that gender is expressed are more spectral. It's not binary. And we're finding this more and more in terms of seeing transgender people and how they're sort of presenting different ways to present gender. And so gender is not just about masculine or feminine. Gender is fluid. Gender is flexible. It's not binary, and it isn't as admissible to what is factual. This is Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger was a physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1933, I believe. You might have heard of the example Schrödinger's cat. Schrödinger's cat is about whether a cat in a box will die of a poison that's introduced in there, and how do you know that the cat's dead or alive unless you check? And so he was trying to use that example to illustrate the way quantum objects behave, that we don't always know what they're doing until we check. And so the reality of something doesn't present itself until we observe it. And so Schrödinger sort of offered up some thought experiments that help us, but he also recognized the limitations of scientific fact. He said, I am astonished that the scientific picture of the world is so deficient. It gives a lot of factual information and puts our experiences in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all that is really near to our heart, all that really matters to us. Science knows nothing of beautiful, ugly, good or bad, God, and eternity. So, conclusions. What we're dealing with is frames of reference. We're dealing with ways of interpreting the world. We've seen this with all the presentations today. Everyone has a particular frame of reference from which they operate. Everyone has a context from which they operate. There is no way to get to truth of any kind without recognizing the context in which it is presented. And because of that, recognizing the context, recognizing the frame is critical to what it means to get to the truth. The different academic disciplines all have different frames of reference. They have different methodologies. They have different criteria for interpreting the world. And so different academic disciplines operate with different frames of reference. They're all groping at that elephant, trying to figure out which part of the elephant is the entire truth. One part of anything, though, cannot be the entire truth of the world. And so we rely on each other. We rely on social networking, interdependency. We rely on each other to give us the fuller picture of what it is we're looking at. This is why it's so critical that we stay in dialogue with each other, respectful dialogue. And this is something that goes all the way back to Socrates. Socrates reminds us that we are all full of divine reason. And this is what I think was meant by Dr. Fleming's interest in common sense. We all have something in us that gives us a certain window into what's true. So we all have different frames of reference. Relying on dialectic and interaction helps us get to the fuller picture of that elephant and what is true. So if you remember that your frame of reference is always going to be imperfect, it's always going to be incomplete. You are never going to have the full picture of anything, even your own experience. If we remember Dr. Getz's presentation, you don't even have your memories that are reflective of objective reality. So truth is possible when we recognize the interdependency of frames of reference between persons, between academic discipline. We all recognize that we all have something to contribute to what it means to gain something in terms of what is true. And so this is why in a marriage, I rely on my husband to tell me what he's really feeling, what he's really going through. I rely on him to be truthful, to be trustworthy. He relies on me for those same things. And together, we form something of truth in the marriage if we're both committed to the truth of each other's perceptions. So that's the presentation. I am going to stop my screen sharing. Hope that was all clear on some level.
Thank you all so much for those fascinating discussions. We have a few questions that the students have been asking. The first one, and I think, you know, a lot of these will be for all four of you, so please chime in if you have something to add. I think one question, and this was a little bit directed at Dr. Fleming-Davies, but also I think it's relevant for everyone, was about, do we find that younger generations that are surrounded by these misinformations from birth are better at detecting them than older generations? That might not be a Fleming-Davies answer, so I'll open it up to all four of you.
Yes, I have no idea. I will defer to Dr. Moran and Dr. Getz probably, or Dr. Babka as well. Yeah, I don't know if studies have been done on how generational, like on how your generational effects on whether people believe what they see. Do others know? I would love to know.
I mean, what we know in terms of media use, if we're looking at kind of trust in misinformation, it is more likely that people who did not grow up with social media are less critical of what they see on social media because they haven't been introduced in the same way. It is more likely too that, and it's not just generational, it's actually as you age, you become more susceptible to misinformation. You know, 30 years ago, we were doing research on like sweepstakes and, you know, the fact that seniors were more likely to believe that they had won a sweepstakes than younger generations. So, you know, as you age and your cognitive capacities change over time, you tend to believe things more likely. This is also why there's a lot of regulation on advertising, particularly when it's targeting different groups. So when you advertise to children, you have more regulation. When you advertise, you know, pharmaceutical drugs, there's more regulation, particularly if it's targeted to an older population. So absolutely, your pre-existing abilities, both cognitively and then your education level, will impact the likelihood that you'll believe or not believe certain types of information. But again, even the highly educated folks are susceptible to misinformation when it confirms their pre-existing beliefs.
The next question was during Dr. Moran's talk, and the question was, do you think that the responsibility should be more on creators to not spread misinformation, or the public to be wary and not trust everything that they see?
I think it's a combination. But I do believe that when you have what we might call a big microphone or a big megaphone to shout to the entire world, that you do have a responsibility to take that communicative act seriously. And I believe that we should be holding people accountable when they spread misinformation. But again, we all also have a responsibility to be thoughtful consumers of media content. We debate this for an entire semester in one of my classes, so it's fun.
We're getting fascinating tidbits of courses that we can take. There's a question that just came in directly to me, so I'm going to put that in the chat, but I'm going to go back to the questions that we compiled. So this question was directed towards Dr. Babka, and it was about the difference between truth and facts, and where the idea of trust, as explained in Truth versus Fact article, how does that come into play in relationship to that article?
Well, we can certainly talk more about it in the discussion section, because these are big questions, the relationship of truth and fact. And this gets back into what we can prove. And you might be interested in the law, for example, and lawyers do this all the time. They take, data, and then they argue a certain angle on the data. And then maybe they're able to have a client who's guilty get off and not have to serve any time or pay any fines or anything like that. So how we take something that might be fact or provable and how we argue that is a matter of perception and how we deal with perception. Like, for example, you might remember the O.J. Simpson case a while back. The O.J. Simpson case happened right after some really difficult times in LA in terms of race relations. And so the people who were listening to the data and the arguments in the case were also very untrustworthy of the police and what they did in terms of collecting that data and collecting the evidence in the trial. And so they were convinced by O.J. Simpson's lawyers that the police were not to be trusted. And so if you can't trust the police to gather the evidence that's presented in a trial, that is a problem for how we think about what is true, who really committed the crime. And so this is something that is going to come up all the time in your education and in your life. When you're dealing with even a relationship, like I mentioned with marriage, you're constantly trying to figure out, what is this person really thinking? How do they really feel? And that's part of a communication problem that Dr. Moran is a specialist in. And so we're trying to constantly communicate what we feel, and we're trying to constantly rely on those interpretations. My interpretive frame might be that I have a certain problem with a certain way people talk. That's going to create a problem of interpretation. So facts are limited. I can't even prove to you that I exist. And so facts are limited in terms of what we can prove, what we believe, and what our frameworks are telling us is true.
And I would also add, what we use as evidence doesn't always have to be solely facts, right? And the things that Dr. Babka and Dr. Moran and I would use as evidence are different from what Dr. Getz and Dr. Fleming-Davies would use. So we have arguments that are based in evidence, but not necessarily in provable facts. Dr. Getz, this is a question that I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit. And I think the question was getting at, how do we ask questions that can elicit more objective sorts of prompts for, the question was, if it was specifically about like, if we were to ask the car speed, but I think the general, more broad question is, how do we frame things in a way that circumvents some of the problems that you were discussing around memory and confirmation bias?
Yeah, so I think, in that example, it was how fast are they going, at a certain timestamp, right, is what the person said. So I think, I'm not sure that there's a way to be completely objective in the way you ask the questions. I think it's more understanding that the way you ask the questions can influence it, right? So even if you can be more objective by saying, how fast was the car going at this particular time, right? That is more objective way to do it. But I think even if you are noticing that the words you have an impact, right? That's I think the broader point is that in trying to be objective, even if you think you are being objective, you might not be, because of all of the higher level context things that could be influencing it. So the person, even if you say at this particular timestamp, right, they may still have some interpretation of that. And so trying to be objective in that particular way it's more important to acknowledge that it is hard to be objective, right? And that just a simple one word that you say in a question can influence how people are going to respond. So, and I think that goes back to the idea of what Dr. Babka was talking about the integration, right? And thinking about it from multiple perspectives. And instead of just trying to do it from my perspective, it's better to think about how other people are interpreting that information, so that we're getting to the collective truth as opposed to just what I think is true.
And that is precisely what our core curriculum at USD is set out to do. And that's what Dr. Babka was talking about, the integration element that we'll be talking to. Thank you to all of our dynamic, fabulous faculty who joined us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Babka, Dr. Fleming-Davies, Dr. Moran, and Dr. Getz. It was a pleasure.